Prayer in public school, housing reform, and America's talking, all on the Center Square Daily. Today is Tuesday, February 24th, 2026. I'm your host, Esther Wickham, standing in for Greg Bishop. First, looking at education, what is happening with prayer in public schools? Well, this past week, the U.S. Department of Education issued a new guidance to public schools all around the country looking at prayer in public schools and tying compliance to federal education funding. Now, this guidance comes after public schools saying that these employees, staff, and students, shouldn't pressure people within the public school system to engage in speech or affirm beliefs that conflict with their students' sincere religious views. Secretary of Education Linda McMahon has said that this policy reaffirms constitutional protections for religious liberty, emphasizing that the First Amendment protects free speech and the free exercise of religion. This comes after President Donald Trump's speech back in September at the Bible Museum, stating that his administration wants to emphasize bringing prayer back into public schools and allowing students and faculty to worship freely. Take a look.
To support students like Hannah, I'm pleased to announce this morning that the Department of Education will soon issue new guidance protecting the right to prayer in our public schools, and it's total protection. Hannah, great job. See what you did, Hannah? Who knew? Who knew that was going to happen, right? Thank you, darling.
President Trump highlights that Hannah and many other students, faculty, and staff have raised concerns over the years about the right to freely express their religion, whether that's praying or worshiping. The Center Square was able to interview Jeremy Dice. He's an attorney at First Liberty, the organization that represented Coach Kennedy, a high school football coach, back in 2022, with that case going all the way to the Supreme Court. Jeremy emphasizes that this new guidance brought by the U.S. Department of Education reflects 250 years of American tradition, saying that this supports religious expression, even in public schools. Well, it's no surprise that there was also some pushback, some concerns raised by other organizations, specifically the Critics' Free Thought Caucus, that raised the concern that is clearly in the Constitution of separation of church and state, arguing that the policy, could blur the line between private and school-sponsored prayer, and the many concerns raised about specifically the government's favoritism when it comes to a specific religion. And so they asked the question of what is that impact going to have on students that have different faiths, whether they're Catholic, Hindu, Buddhists, or those that don't practice faith at all. State education agencies must also file annual reports detailing compliance. And so it'll be interesting to see how public schools respond and if this is going to, open a can of worms, as Free Thought Caucus says, or allow students and faculty to freely express their religion the way they want to without any restrictions. Now looking over at a new proposal for housing reform, the Illinois Municipal League says that it could not allow the state to take zoning control away from local communities. Here to talk a little bit more about it, we have our expert here, Jim Talamonti. He's the Center Square's Illinois reporter. Jim, thanks so much for joining us today.
Esther, thanks so much for having me. Great to be here.
Yeah, so in your reporting, you highlight that Governor J.B. Pritzker of Illinois introduced the Building Up Illinois Development Plan during his budget address this past week. And he says that, these current local regulations have made it too costly and difficult to build new housing. Now, just kind of starting off, tell us a little bit more about what exactly Governor Pritzker is saying and, how this reform, as he says, will significantly lower housing costs.
Well, that's the hope, or at least that's his goal, and that's his stated intention with this, Esther. You look at the situation in housing, and Illinois is not unique here. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle said there is a housing crisis, actually using that word, and especially when it comes to affordable housing. So the governor, and he's talked about doing things about this before, but in his budget address, he said these reforms are going to eliminate unnecessary barriers and lower costs for housing construction. So he's looking at providing a wider range of what he called family friendly housing types and streamlining construction processes. So the issue, however, is that you have local zoning boards and municipal governments who generally control these kinds of things, and this would give the state oversight, and so the state would allow for housing, in different circumstances that perhaps local, zoning boards or local governments might have concerns about. And so the opposition here from the Municipal League, the Illinois Municipal League, is that this would take control away from local communities and hand that zoning authority over to the state, even if there might be concerns at the local level, those would be bypassed in a sense here. And so you would have state government taking over that control from local communities. The governor says, well, this is going to help streamline things, get more housing built, more types of housing more quickly. But again, in some communities, there's concern that we might not want a certain kind of housing on a certain street or in a certain location. And so that's where I think we're going to see some negotiating, at the very least, or some discussion in committee hearings as we get into legislative session and there are hearings on what the governor is putting forward.
Yeah, and just like you said, the Municipal League has some concerns over that power struggle, right, between state deregulation and local communities wanting a say. From your conversation with the league, do you have any sense of what that kind of conversation looks like? As you said, how are they going to find that balance between allowing local communities to kind of stay intact, right? Because every local community is different, every area is different. How are they going to justify that kind of, it's not a one size fits all, right? It's going to look different for every district.
Right, Esther. It's a good question. And I think in my conversation with Brad Cole, he's the Illinois Municipal League CEO, he touched on a couple of things that I think we will hear more about when the legislation the governor's pushing forward gets into committee. And there are committee hearings. So what Cole said, when it comes to the cost of housing, some of the issues the governor's talking about really don't affect cost, according to him anyway, according to Cole. He said when you talk about issues with how many stairs are in an apartment building or setback distances around single-family homes, these aren't things that really these aren't the things that are making housing more expensive. What's making housing more expensive is the inflation we've seen in recent years. The prices of goods and services have gone up, and just actual construction costs. And construction costs in Illinois tend to be fairly high compared with neighboring states. So when you couple that with the overall inflation that the nation has experienced, you have housing becoming less affordable, just like a lot of other things have, right? So, and Cole said local officials are incentivizing home ownership and housing development, but the governor, for his part, says, well, this isn't happening. We just don't have enough affordable housing for people. And not just when you say affordable, not just like low income housing, but he even talked about this morning at an unrelated event in Chicago. He said, affordable housing. We're not talking about low income here. We're talking about middle America housing. So I think some of what we'll see discussed are, as you said, Esther, local control. Are we going to let the state control little things like setback distances and how many stairs, if these are particular local issues? Certainly, I think everyone wants to see more affordable housing, but how do you get there? Do you worry about the little details? The Chicagoland Apartment Association also had some concerns. On the positive side, saying streamlining zoning restrictions and allowing for greater development, that's a good thing. Reducing barriers, there are sometimes long permitting timelines, that's all good. But the Chicagoland Apartment Association Executive VP Michael Minnie said raising taxes and having fees and regulatory hurdles, again, things Illinois is pretty well known for, these are things that drive up costs and reduce development. So I think those are things we're also going to hear about as we get into session, and this piece of legislation, or pieces, I think more likely pieces of legislation, are discussed.
Yeah, and it looks like, as you said, there's multiple things going on, right? It's not just one issue that's going to impact the cost of housing. Jim, I wanted to get your thoughts on what's happening kind of over next to Illinois, the state of Michigan. The Center Square reported, our reporter Elise Apel said that in Michigan, there is a new proposal of legislation, the Housing Readiness Package, that essentially, as you said, kind of does something similar when it comes to, modernizing development processes to reduce, as the state representative Kristen Grant says, unnecessary costs and delays. And they ultimately want to make affordable housing across the state. And a way to do that is this proposed plan of rising housing costs by changing the zoning laws. Now, I wanted to get your thoughts on that specifically, but I think also looking at the broader picture of the country, are we going to start seeing other states pop up when it comes to changing zoning laws and affecting local communities in other states?
I think that's a good question, Esther. I think there's a good chance already. You see here two states that don't border each other but are very close in the Midwest, Illinois and Michigan, with, as you said, pretty similar proposals here. Now, in Michigan, there seems to be a fair amount of bipartisan support, and I think when you look at, you mentioned the state rep who introduced this being a Democrat, but there's also Republican support for this 9-bill package that's being pushed forward, and I think you're generally going to get Republican support when you talk about streamlining and cutting costs and those kinds of things. When you start talking about state control, then it becomes a little bit more complicated. So, but again, it's interesting. Some of the quotes you see from the people in the two states are very similar in terms of trying to address this situation in terms of housing. And it's not uncommon, of course, if one state does something, another state nearby, or maybe not even nearby, we'll end up picking up the ball and carrying that as well. We've seen a lot of different pieces of state legislation start in California, right, or New York. And certainly in Illinois, we've seen a lot of statewide initiatives that got their start in Chicago or Cook County. So Michigan's plan, certainly, again, we're seeing a statewide, for example, prohibition on minimum parking space requirements. And so that, again, similar to some proposals we've seen in Chicago and Illinois. And again, the opposition to this is likely to come from people who don't want to see big state control here. In the Michigan's case, the Michigan Township Association says, well, affordable housing is essential, but it should not come at the expense of local input. And that's a quote from the Michigan Township Association to Elise, our reporter there. So that's where I think you're going to have some give and take. And we have groups like township associations, apartment associations, municipal leagues. They're going to have concerns about surrendering local control, community involvement over to state agencies, and as critics would say, bureaucrats in and around state capitals instead of people in their own local communities.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see how, these states play out. And as you said, that conversation with those local communities, and if other states follow suit. Jim, thanks so much for joining us today and kind of adding your input. For those interested in following his stories, you can go to thecentersquare.com. Now looking over at America's Talking, let's look at a few quick hits from the Center Square page. First story coming out of the state of Louisiana. Louisiana education leaders now are expanding the use of artificial intelligence in schools through new vendor partnerships, funding, and teacher training initiatives, while emphasizing literacy gains, data privacy, and caution amid concerns around AI in general. Lawmakers, parents, teachers, many people around the country have seen the impact of AI, and there's continued concern whether it's a good or bad thing. So continue to follow that and more. Now looking at the state of Virginia, Virginia lawmakers recently unveiled competing budget proposals, with the Senate seeking to end the state's sales tax exemption for data center equipment to generate new revenue for education and other priorities, while the House relies on existing revenues and proposes different funding allocations for K through 12 and higher education. Next, Wisconsin, the state of Wisconsin, a new report from the Institute for Reforming Government highlights that Wisconsin's 15-year effort to expand legislative oversight of state agencies through reforms like the red tape reset bill, while cautioning other states to structure similar measures carefully after a state Supreme Court ruling limited these lawmakers' power to essentially block the regulation. And finally, the state of New York. New York Governor Kathy Hochul recently announced that there is going to be a new state regulation requiring a, quote, buy now, pay later lenders to be licensed and limiting fees, penalties, and data misuse in an effort to protect consumers from predatory lending practices. So we'll see how that affects the state of New York, especially since they've been hit with a massive blizzard storm, but I'm sure the governor will be able to see that through. All of these stories can be found on our website at thecentersquare.com. Well, from my studio here in Southern California, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm your host, Esther Wickham. We will be back on Wednesday looking at more articles that impact you, the taxpayer, here only on the Center Square Daily.